One of the things that is not talked about a lot is the organization systems of Africa. The greatest thing about a kingdom is how they come together. In fact, it's probably the highest form of intelligence because unified, a kingdom can carry out feats that are impossible even for the most intelligent. As they say, the mind does the thinking, the hands does the work, and the heart gives the motive. If we look at Messina, otherwise known as the Empire of Hamdulillah, what they have is a system of transportation of letters. These letters, which were often written up by nobles, would be distributed to certain people around the areas, especially of importance. But this is only one way of distributing letters. See, in order to have a functioning communication system, you need three ways of communication. You need peer to peer, which is probably the most expensive one, as there are more individuals inside your kingdom than there are nobles or kings, and even communication outside of your civilization becomes more and more difficult, which did happen in all African kingdoms that were built up as empires. The second is from nobles to the general public or from noble to noble. This system was easier to do and more common in most places around the world than the other, peer to peer. Now, the reason why this one was so simple, especially in these West African kingdoms, is because they had madrasas, they had markets, they had places where when people are gathered, a person, usually riding a horse or a camel, would show up with a message from the king. This could be fast. In other words, this could be something that happened immediately, impromptu, and it could be slow. It could be a gathering that was prepared for a long time so that it could deliver a message to the people, maybe about the change of a noble, maybe about the state or the change of a law or something. But this information needed to go out. The third, the third would be the newspaper style writings. So, in other words, information that the general public needs to know, but it doesn't come either directly from the king or from a direct human being. Now, all three of these existed, especially if we go back to the Kingdom of Mali, if we go back to Sokoto, if we go to the Cholof, if we go to the Swahili coast, or anywhere really, all three of these existed at one time. Now, of course, newspapers is a very specific thing, and I'm not claiming that those existed in any of those kingdoms in the way that it existed later in other places around the world. But there were systems of communication that were made that acted like newspapers so that people could be informed not only about the truth, but they could also be informed about gossip. Let's start with peer to peer communication. So, what's written here in this video that we are about to watch, which documents a piece of South African history. This piece has been confirmed by the apartheid government before, as they some of these messages that were sent in South Africa were confiscated by the South African government, and they tried to decipher their meanings. So what this says is imibala yobuhlalu nencazelo yakhona. So it means the colors of the tradition of sending beads as messages. Nencazelo yakhona means and their explanations, meaning what do they mean. Now, this is a brilliant video and it's definitely on YouTube, so I'll leave the link in the description. Before I do anything about that, let's look at um, this founding of the letters from UCLA by Frank Jollis. This is called Utu. This thing, it's a Zulu love letter. In other words, this is a form of writing, and it's got a description right in the middle, which we'll zoom into and check it out. And then we will go and look into the video and how it describes exactly how this all worked. So let's start with a couple things. One, so a lot of the Zulu people called the beads that were sent to workers, so some females who were not allowed to work in mines and stuff like that, they would send beaded letters explaining the situation in which they were in to people, to their family members, by beading animals or food that they were going to give to their husbands. And so the Europeans who are unaware would send these packages to these men for a price, obviously, and these men could understand the situation going on back home by these letters. Now remember, this was a time when these people were quote unquote illiterate or couldn't write in the ways of the English, but they could write in these ways. So if we read it, we can see here it says one before marriage, and lobola, which is dowry for a wife. If a man wants a girl for a long time and she at last says, "Yes, I like you," then she sends this and a small face cloth towel and small towel for wishing to him by her friends. So, in other words, this little pattern here has a specific message which is sent by a woman to a man if she desires to say yes to the other letters or the other courtship of the man. At the bottom, you have a description. This is by Frank Jollis, by the way. You have a description of what the letter says. Now, it looks like a random pattern to normal people. And of course, if you are illiterate, if you don't speak Chinese, it just looks like a bunch of patterns. But if you speak this language, or if you write this language, at the bottom, you can see the pattern with the description. Inhliziyo umhlophe, meaning the heart is white. In my heart, in white, that is why or how she made it. That is a direct translation. The translation of it is, which is in my heart is white, is my heart is open to the person that I give this to. So, in other words, it's an acceptance letter allowing the people to get married. Now, here's the thing, and you can see here in date of accusation made for 1960s, made just before marriage, be worn at marriage. Now, here's the thing. There were other versions of this that had nothing to do with love, that had to do with sending messages of concern and things like that. And this is an ancient African tradition, or at least West African tradition, that spread because of the Bantu expansion and made its way down to southern Africa and is still around in some places, but obviously has been overtaken by, I mean, today, the internet, let's be honest. Who would use beads when you have the internet? So let's go back to the video. So what we have here is a granddaughter and a grandmother, and the grandmother is explaining exactly how some of these colors worked and how some of these colors transitioned from one person to the other. So peer to peer communication, explaining the situation in which the family was in. Now, this video is not in English, so I will be translating it after the person speaks.
Kangangokuthi ekufikeni kwabo ubuhlalo abantu bebusebenzisa ngendlela ababebusebenzisa ngazo kwakuyigugu ukuthi nazi insizwa ziyasebenza emadolobheni amakhulu eindaweni ezithile ukhona ohambile waya ekhaya ovakashile emakhaya useyaphathiswa imlayezo lemakhaya.
So what she said was, during the time when African men or Zulu men would travel to European territories to work in their areas, in the cities, what the people would do, what would happen is there would be people who would leave. So they would generally leave to return back to the rural areas where the black people, the Zulu people live, and the other people working amongst them would have them carry, so there would be a porter, would have them carry messages for them to their homes. So, in other words, you have a person who works with the other people, probably in a mine or some other area, a farm, whatever, and he would be given a letter, this form of letter, to send back to whatever village he comes from.
Kwakubalekileke ukuthi ke ekhaya ihlatshwe inkukhu le nkukhu isihlatshiwe yabekwa kahle ibisihlotshiswa ngobuhlalo obuthile ezothi insizwa mayifika ivula leyo nkukhu phambili ilobuhlalo eyobibona buhlobise le nkukhu buchaza isimo ekhaya ukuthi kusinjani mangabe baphethwe umzwangedo uyobona la enkukhwini uma ngabe babhildelwe indlala uzobona la enkukhwini.
She says, in transferring this message, what they would do first is they would kill a chicken, and then that chicken would be decorated with beads. These beads would be the display, or they would display the message that is being conveyed, depicting the situation which the family is going through, whether they're, and this is her examples, whether they were being controlled by one family or if they were in a situation of poverty. Now, I remember that the color pink is the color of poverty. So, in other words, you could have these forms of communication. This has nothing to do with love. This has nothing to do with that, although there is a version of that. But you could see that this is a communication system that is quite sophisticated, that can convey many messages. This already built in system that existed throughout West Africa and the Bantu regions expanded. And it expanded in a way that became good and bad. And I even believe that it continued in some of the Middle Eastern areas where the Bantu people were stranded or taken as slaves, which I think is one of the reasons why they could easily communicate, but they could write in Arabic. But here's the thing, the Africans applied some of these messenger systems to the Arabic systems that allowed them to have a post like system. So, in other words, in the Mali Kingdom, people tended to be situated as families. So you could have the Keita family, you could have the whatever family in one region, and people knew which family was where. Because of this, what would happen is the people would have porters who they could easily say, I want to send a message to someone in this family. And then peer to peer systems would exist that would allow people to send messages to each other easily because they have basically home addresses. even though they don't have official home addresses. Now, of course, the problem with this is that anyone in your family could get the message, and if they didn't like you, you were out of luck. This is an example of one of the letters which had a porter who ported from one place to another. And it was a letter from a king, the king of Hamdallah, and he was rejecting the offer to arrest a German, which one of the people located in Africa assumed was a spy. Was he right or wrong? I don't know. But this is a letter stating why he will refuse to arrest this German in Africa. This is from the 1800s. It's still pre colonial. So the letter says the response of Ahmed al-Bakai to the letter of Amir Ahmad, ruler of Messina. So we don't need to read the first few lines because they're just talking about the kingdom itself. Now remember, this is a letter, not a document that was meant to be read, hundreds of years later or anything like that. This document is a reply to the ruler of Messina, present day Messina or Makina, Amir Ahmad, who ordered the arrest of a noted German explorer, Heinrich Barth, in 1821 to 1865, who was suspected of spying for the British. There are two copies of the work, a shorter version and a longer version, which incorporates information not given in the shorter. Shown here is the longer version. The author of reply cites Islamic law in arguing that the arrest is illegal and declines to obey the Amir. The scholar states that a non-Muslim entering the domain of Muslims in peace is protected and may not be arrested, have his property confiscated, or to be otherwise hindered. Now, this is in harsh contrast to some of the other places, but let's focus on the letter version of it. So you can see here that not only is there a porting of a letter, but he has to give two versions of the letter, a short version and a long version. And the reason why he does this is because there's a trusted system of delivery where the long letter is given. So the long letter is given via the royal trusted porter, and then the shorter version is given via the non-royal, so the commoners peer-to-peer system. And both of them arrived to the person and he understood it, and luckily they didn't tear it up in anger or anything like that, so we still have it today. There's translations of it, but that's not the point of this video. Now, since we're talking about peer-to-peer, before we move on to the other ones, let's go to the Swahili coast. So in the Swahili coast, there's something called runner routes. Runner routes were other versions of translating or transmitting messages peer-to-peer, so family to family, really. These runner routes acted as a way for people to communicate to one another, firstly over long distances, but then secondly even after short distances, and with pay. And so these were really a pre-colonial postal service that existed in the Swahili coast. So as you can see, dotted around a lot of these places, based on a pre-existing African peer-to-peer system, it grew dramatically depending on the size of the civilization. And it wasn't even a conscious thing because it was already in the system. The idea of having a home address and all of that just naturally occurred. Something that is not understood is that the colonial system of letters inside of Tanzania and other Swahili regions, and also in Namibia, was influenced highly by the pre-colonial postal systems. So in other words, there were systems inside of West Africa, East Africa that operated, but the ones that were specifically copied were the ones in East Africa, in which the people had runners, and these runners would send letters peer to people, and somehow this was maintained. And the colonialists, the Germans, wanted to understand how this worked. This was something that they actually spent a lot of time studying. It wasn't something like the others where there's vague information or a lot of it is trapped inside oral history. This was something that was written about, documented, and fell inside of the very system of the colonialists until, of course, they created a system that utilized some people who they personally educated inside of their schools. In this short essay called Crude Speeches, meaning really crude speeches or makeshift speeches, the emergence of Shauri as colonial praxis in German East Africa. Now, the word Shauri is a Swahili word, and it meant something like council or coming together or giver of law, something like that. So it had to do with organization of some kind. So this is a paper, and we will see that there's another person who agrees with this person. And they talk about these pre colonial systems that were adopted by these colonialists. So let's read. This paper circles around Bimmeler's argument in the first section. I will show how European travelers produced what I call here practical knowledge, and how this knowledge was later transferred into colonial knowledge in its most literal sense, into knowledge about establishing colonial rule. In the case of the European exploration, such practical knowledge was produced for a very practical goal: to travel in Eastern Africa, or more dramatically, to guarantee the travelers surviving. It had to answer questions like how to organize an expedition or caravan, how to recruit and to treat porters, how to obtain food and water, and not in the least, how to negotiate with African porters, traders, and chiefs along the way by trying to find answers to these questions. The European travelers did not reinvent the art of traveling in Eastern Africa, but rather built upon local experiences and knowledge. It's almost impossible to isolate the letter givers in the Swahili coast, as there are so many ways that they did it, and some of them were oral. So, in other words, you're telling someone a message, and then they travel for a while, depending on where the message is going, and then you say it to the other person. Now, these are still official people. In other words, they are people who were paid to do this, not people who were playing around or anything like that. Now, there are people who gave away letters, and of course, we know from people like Vasco da Gama and all these people that some of these letters could reach as far as, from one kingdom to another. We don't need to give specific names because we saw them do it. We saw them organizing with each other to try and capture the Portuguese at one time. But the system of letters that existed was not just limited to porters, it also went overseas. This is how letters would get to people who were located in India, which is one of the things that the Germans noticed when they got there, was that there were always people from India, Arabia, and other places located inside there in case there were messages that needed to go from this place to another. These people were usually traveled through market areas. So, in other words, let's say there's a trade going on between Melinda and Sofala. These letter holders would hitchhike, or they would hike on top of these caravans, and travel with those people to deliver the letters, even though it was peer to peer, even though it had nothing to do with the king or the queen or that specific market thing or anything. And this is how these systems were made. And this is why it's interesting, because the Germans noticed porters all along the route, meaning that this was a thriving, a booming business. And it was so thriving and useful that they utilized it in their early postal systems in order to create the newer postal systems. And then they copied it and used it in places like Namibia, in places like other places which were part of their holding. So let's carry on reading about this. So, as we continue to read, the traders relied heavily on the cooperation of local people in securing supplies of food and drinking water, as well as for their knowledge about the region. But in the atmosphere of mistrust and violence, the path between peace and war was small. The traders used a lament about the thieving locals, while locals became angry about marauding caravan parties neglecting to pay for food and services provided to them. The arrival of the caravan at the village or residence of an African ruler was therefore a crucial and risky moment. Small incidents could easily provoke full scale wars. Rituals and diplomatic ceremonies called by the traders Shauri helped to overcome the mutual mistrust and to prepare the space for negotiations. The Shauri emerged in this context as a bricolage of cultural practices of different origins. Shauri is a Swahili word for having a council. However, despite these etymological origins, the Shauri was not only an offspring of the Swahili culture, although it borrowed much from it. If we shift essays and we go and look at Cambridge, we can see there is a essay called Spilling Millet, the East African Post, and the Studied Bureaucratic Knowledge. Now, in here, they talk about how the Germans or the Europeans tried to set up these European postal systems. But not only did they have a problem setting them up, because of course the postal systems are to generate money, and so when they to generate money, it's good that the locals use them too, as they also have some level of money. But what happened was the locals didn't trust it and continued using their own systems. So they not only were they ancient systems that were already in place, but the newer systems that were faster or whatever also had disadvantages that led to these two systems competing with each other. As we read, in a similar way, East African observing and engaging with the postal service incorporated its material elements and their operation into existing discourses, including cosmological, pathological, and meteorological. They also incorporated the post into existing understandings and methods of message sending and mobility. For long distance communication was certainly nothing new in the region. Stephen Rockel's research on the caravan trade, for instance, detailed a sophisticated system of movement involving coastal capital, inland professional porters, and network of roadside communities, each demonstrating specialized knowledge and recognized expertise. By the mid 19th century, tens of thousands of people moved along these routes every year. The system of long distance trade between coast and interior, moreover, built upon well trodden regional networks established by the mid 18th century, serviced by professional porters from the Yao, the Nyamwezi, the Kimbu, and the Sumbwa communities. These existing infrastructures and practices, what Andreas Greiner referred to as vernacular infrastructure, patterned the interventions of the early German colonial state. When Germany committed itself to consolidating control of its colonial territories in the 1890s and early 1900s, it did not simply replace pre existing structures, but most often had to engage, coexist, and even compete with them. The first military posts were built beside the path of trade caravans, and later administrative stations were founded in communities which had long served the trade, even after the fitful start of road building and railway construction, the latter gaining momentum after the Maji Maji War of 1905 to 7. Caravan porters continued to travel known routes in their thousands, combining stretches of travel by rail, government road, and known footpaths. Now, here's the thing that also happened. Once new infrastructure like trains and stuff like that were built, some of these porters that existed in these regions were utilizing some of the new technologies that existed. For example, when trains were introduced, some of these porters would hop on the train and deliver messages in that way. Now, of course, the people had to investigate why would people trust one individual with letters more than they would trust the post office. Now, according to this essay, they found a letter documented which the people sort of explained a worry that the people had. So listen here. It says in one of these essays, the authors deployed a modified version of an aforementioned proverb to describe how some East Africans initially regarded the post office. Walipo kuku wengi mtu haifai kumwaga mchele. Where there are lots of chickens, a person would do well not to spill rice. And this meant the easy writer's interpretation, the proverbs, as a caution against using the post because, in light of everything moving through the busy office, one's message would certainly be lost in the shuffle. It would be swallowed up by busy chickens. Now, the interesting thing is, I noticed a lot of words here that I recognize. Walipo is probably Lapo in Zulu. Kuku is Nkuku, which is chicken. Mtu is probably a human. Okay, so I think they translated that perfectly. Now, I don't want to give the impression that this system was obviously better than the postal system because it wasn't. That's why the postal system eventually won. But I do want to make you understand that it was studied because it was greater than just a bunch of people. Like it's better than, a mother wants to send a message to a kid, so he tells he to another family, so he tells his kid to go take this letter and give it to the other family. It was better than that. It was a system, a controlled system, where there were porters who were everywhere, whose only job was to pass letters, and they were fully aware of the environment and were fully aware of where the thieves are and all this other stuff, so that they acted like the real postal system. And in all the descriptions that I've seen, it was essentially the same thing. Now, of course, once you start adding the ability for trains to carry large amounts of post and all this other stuff, then you start to lose against, no matter how many thousands of people they had, at some point, it's too expensive. It's too much. Now, I didn't even start to explain this type of trade of both food and letters. So we would be in a very good position if people would continue to like, share, and subscribe so that I could upload more videos. I'll call this part one because I I didn't expand on the empires of West Africa and how their ports worked. I promise you they worked very similar to that of the Swahili, but I wanted to give the Swahili example. Otherwise, this video would be 7 hours long if I went through every single African kingdom and how their postal services worked prior to the Europeans. Thank you.